Welcome. Today we will introduce the Minnesota Department of Transportation's Carbon Emissions Tool, also known as CET. If you manage to find this training, you are likely interested in learning more about the Carbon Emissions Tool. But what is it? Let's start with some background. The Carbon Reduction Program, CRP, is a new federal program that funds projects that reduce carbon emissions from surface transportation. This funding program is part of the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, with a proportional allocation to the state of Minnesota. Currently, MPOs and districts are selecting projects for fiscal years 2025 and 2026 by June 2024 for inclusion in the state's Transportation Infrastructure Plan, or STIP. As part of the project selection and solicitation process, jurisdictions and district staff are asked to use the Carbon Emissions Tool, or CET, to calculate the carbon emissions reductions from the project and the cost effectiveness of carbon reduction for that project. Minnesota will consider multiple co-benefits in project selection, such as equity, safety, access, and health. However, cost effectiveness of the project to reduce carbon emissions is the biggest factor. This tool can be found along with the in-depth instruction manual for use on the CRS website. It should be the same site which is hosting this training. Now, let's dig into how this tool calculates emission reductions. The CET quantifies a broad range of project types in the CRS. With the exception of low-carbon infrastructure projects, the emission benefits consider only tailpipe emission reductions from vehicles. This ignores upstream emissions like those from production and refining of gasoline. For each project type, the tool calculates both an annual emission reduction and a cumulative emission reduction for a project's full lifetime. This can be useful for knowing which projects lead to the quickest reductions. The cost effectiveness calculations consider carbon emission reductions over the whole project lifetime. It should be noted that the carbon reductions specified in the tool use emission factors for CO2 equivalent, which allows full quantification of all GHG emissions beyond just carbon dioxide. If you want more details about the specific formulas and sources for assumptions in the carbon emissions tool, check out Appendix D of the Carbon Reduction Strategy, as shown here in this picture. In developing the tool, several authoritative sources were used to develop the calculations for emission reductions. Two of the main sources are CARB's CCI tools and the CAPCOA handbook. Both are used for calculating project-level and community-level emission benefits and evaluating cost-effective investments in GHG reduction. Calculations for benefits from transportation system management use FHWA's CMAQ calculator, and those for low-carbon infrastructure use MnDOT's MICE tool. All project types use Minnesota's specific emission factors from EPA's MOVES 4, as well as other state-specific inputs where possible. This includes data from sources like Minnesota Pollution Control Agency and Met Council. Now that we know what the tool does, let's get a sense for how to use it. First, let's note that CET is an Excel spreadsheet-based tool. Thus, users must have Excel to be able to take advantage of all of its features. The CET enables the user to calculate the carbon emission benefits of 26 transportation project types falling under the Minnesota Carbon Reduction Strategy, or CRS, for the categories of electrification, travel options, and low-carbon infrastructure and system management. To use the tool, we follow this four-step process. First, identify the project type. Then go to that project tab and enter the project-specific information as inputs. Then, go to the Results Summary tab and enter the project cost. And finally, review the emission reductions and cost effectiveness. As shown in the diagram here, the spreadsheet includes individual calculation tabs for specific types of projects. These calculation tabs allow the user to input information about the project to calculate the carbon emission benefits of the project. The first three dark green tabs labeled Overview, Mapping, and Results Summary are where users will likely start and end the analysis. The Overview tab provides descriptions, definitions, and examples of project types contained within the tool, as shown here. Mapping tab provides information on which calculation tab to use depending on the project type. Finally, the Results Summary tab provides the emission calculation results after a user completes emission reduction calculations on the project-specific tab or tabs. On the Results Summary tab, users will also be able to input the overall cost of the project, and the CET will determine the cost effectiveness of that project based on the cost input. Here, we can see the first set of projects in the tool. Projects related to installing EV charging infrastructure fall under project codes E1 and E2. Those related to fleet electrification, or EV car sharing, fall under E3 through E6. Projects which don't fit into a specific bucket may be able to be quantified with the catch-all calculator for VMT reduction found on T15. We will show an example of using this to estimate the benefits of an EV outreach program later in the presentation. Next, we have all of our active transportation projects. This includes calculators for bike and ped projects, as well as micromobility programs in T1 through T3. We also have a calculator for improving street connectivity on T4. As noted before, projects which don't fit into one of these buckets, like smart crosswalk systems, may be able to be quantified with project type T15. Our next set of calculators estimate the benefits of transit projects, both in the urban and intercity and regional contexts. This includes things like expanding bus service, adding BRT, and adding intercity rail. It should be noted that these calculators consider the new emissions of the bus or train service added as part of the benefit calculations, so new services with low expected ridership may lead to negative GHG benefits. That said, electric buses or rail have zero tailpipe emissions and always lead to emission reductions. Also, CRP funds can only be used for capital projects or planning and cannot be put towards operations. This should be considered when choosing what part of a project might qualify for funding. The last set of project types covers three diverse areas. This includes system optimization projects like signal coordination or installing roundabouts in T12 through T14, low carbon infrastructure projects in LC1 through 3, and renewable energy generation projects in RE1 and RE2. As noted earlier, LC1 and LC2 use the MICE tool for estimating the benefits, and T12 through T14 use outputs from the FHWA CMAQ calculator tool. More information on how to use those is given in each project tab and in the user's guide. We will also show an example today. Once project data is input into the project tab, the emissions reduction for that project is calculated on the Results Summary tab, both for year 1 and the project lifetime. Cost effectiveness is also calculated for each project. This requires the project sponsor or applicant know the project cost as an input. As we can see here, the formula for this is quite simple, dividing the project cost by the cumulative emissions reduction of the project. Projects with multiple components can be calculated here as shown under the total cost effectiveness, this gray bar at the bottom. We should note that LCI projects, or low carbon infrastructure projects, do not have an annual emission reduction because their reductions are life cycle reductions. Since cumulative emissions are a main input in determining cost effectiveness, it is important to correctly estimate the project lifetime. Defaults for all project types are shown here. However, users should always use project-specific data if that is expected to differ from the default. For example, a micromobility program with a known program length of only 2 years should use 2 years instead of the 5-year default. Vehicle projects may have a shorter or longer lifetime depending on their expected use profile. However, infrastructure projects such as bike infrastructure should not exceed the 20-year project horizon. Also, the calculator planning horizon extends through 2050, so projects which are expected to last past 2050 cannot be calculated. Next, let's take a look at a typical project tab. At the top, we have instructions on how to use the tab. Below, we have the input section where project-specific data must be input. Orange cells require user input for the calculator to function, whereas yellow cells can use the regional default or project-specific input if known. When changed, you can reset to the defaults by clicking the button at the top. It says Reset to Default. Values used in the calculator, such as constants or intermediate results, are found in the next section. And at the bottom, the estimated emission reductions are found in the results section. All cells except for the inputs are locked and cannot be edited.
If the project horizon extends past 2050, the calculator will produce an error because it only has emissions data through the year 2050. Here is an example of what that error message looks like. For less obvious inputs, additional context can be found by hovering over the input name to reveal useful guidance. For example, here we can see a pop-up window describing more information about fast charger utilization rate.
As mentioned earlier, the T15 tab serves as a catch-all for transportation projects which don't fit into any of the other methodologies. This calculator assumes the project sponsor can estimate the light-duty or heavy-duty VMT reduction from the project and converts that into emission reductions. If this project type is used, make sure that there is good justification, like survey data or academic research, backing up the estimated VMT reductions, as that will be scrutinized in project selection. Now that we know all about the carbon emissions tool, let's take a look at some project examples. First, let us consider an EV charger project. This calculator requires the user to know how many chargers are installed and at what level. Like all projects, it also requires knowing the project implementation year. If known, it also takes charger power level, utilization rate, and annual hours when available to use. Our example project includes 4 DCFC chargers across 2 locations and at 2 different power levels. Since CET only has room for 1 power level, what should we do? Here we will examine 2 approaches. So the first approach would be to calculate the emission benefits for the 30 kilowatt and the 120 kilowatt chargers separately, and then add them up, and use that to find the cost effectiveness. In this case, as we can see in the table, this comes to $181 per metric ton for the cost effectiveness. The second calculation approach would be to find the average power level per port. As we can see with the calculation here, it comes out to 75 kilowatts per port. This produces the same emissions reduction and thus the same cost effectiveness as the other approach at $181 per metric ton. This method is slightly more straightforward since all the results are contained on the Summary tab and only one run is needed. Next, let's consider a fleet transition project. This calculator requires knowing the vehicle type, number of vehicles replaced, and daily VMT per vehicle. For our example, we have a police department looking to replace a gas cruiser by leasing an EV cruiser for 3 years. To calculate the emission benefits for our cruiser replacement, this data is input at the top of the tab. As you can see, the calculator can accommodate up to 3 different vehicle types at the same time. Results are then automatically pulled into the Results tab, and by inputting the proposed project cost of $15,000, the cost effectiveness is shown on the right. This gives a cost effectiveness of $1,500 per metric ton. Now, let's consider a bicycle infrastructure project. As expected, this calculator considers the differences in utility between typical on-road bike lanes and bicycle facilities which are protected or off-road. This calculator requires the user to input the type of facility, characteristics about the town or city, the length of the bikeway, the number of nearby attractions, and the AADT of a roadway parallel to the bicycle facility. It allows for variation in the annual days in use to consider environments like a college campus where a bikeway might be plowed or maintained for year-round use, or a bikeway that is not going to be available year-round. It can also take adjustments to the average bike trip length in the place or city of interest. Our example is an off-trail bike facility that is 1 mile in length in a small city with 12,000 AADT along a parallel roadway. To use the bicycle calculator, We take these inputs and fill them into the tool in the orange cells at the top. Then cost information will be pulled into the Results tab to find the cost effectiveness in this project. This gives a cost effectiveness of $1,148 per metric ton. Now, our example project type is T9 for intercity bus service. This can be used for new or expanded intercity bus service to give riders options for traveling between cities other than using their own cars. This tool considers both the reductions in emissions from car trips, which are avoided, as well as the added emissions from new bus travel. Thus, if a new service is expected to have relatively low ridership, it is possible for this tool to show no net emission reduction. Of course, for electric bus service or hydrogen bus service, the calculator will always show emission reductions. As inputs, the calculator requires the bus's fuel type, expected ridership increase, expected bus mileage, as well as optional inputs for trip length and the percentage of riders who are transit dependent. For our example project, we consider a diesel bus service with 120,000 riders annually and 108,000 annual miles. We then estimate the length of displaced trips to be 80% of the terminal-to-terminal distance of the bus service, to account for distance traveled before and after the bus trip. Here we can see all of our inputs put into the orange part of the calculator, and in the green section, the emission reductions are calculated in metric tons of CO2. For this project, we have a reduction of around 8,500 metric tons, leading to a cost effectiveness of $627 per metric ton. This is all shown in this project cost tool under the Results Summary tab. Now, as noted earlier, because our calculations consider the new emissions from a bus service, if the ridership was not as good for this program, it would be possible for the emission reductions to actually be negative, leading to a negative or no cost effectiveness. However, if we use an electric bus service, we always will get emission reductions because electric vehicles have zero tailpipe emissions. Our next example project type is T12 for roundabout projects. As mentioned earlier, this project type takes advantage of FHWA's CMAQ calculator tool. This calculator tool can be used for any project which adds a roundabout to an existing 3- or 4-way intersection, which will significantly reduce drivers' travel delays. As inputs, the calculator requires several details about each approach direction, which are then used to calculate the total delay reduction per day. Using Minnesota-specific emission factors, the CET then converts that delay reduction into an emission reduction. For our example project, we consider an urban roundabout project with 4 approach directions and 5,000 AADT, or annual average daily trips, which would result in a daily delay reduction of 21.8 hours. Now, in our calculator, we take the resulting delay reduction estimated from the CMAQ calculator tool and input that into the orange section. This provides an estimate of our emission reduction as 456 metric tons of CO2 with a cost effectiveness of around $3,000 per metric ton. As noted earlier, T15 project type is a generic project type for reducing VMT from light-duty or medium and heavy-duty vehicles. This can be used for any project types that do not fit under E1 through E6 or T1 through T14. As we mentioned, this considers VMT displacement from these vehicles. So anything that would lead to these vehicles not being driven as much could be considered for this type of project. In our example, we will consider a community outreach program for EV awareness. As you can see, these are all the details for this program. It's got a target audience of 1,000 people per year. For this community, the current amount of driving per year of a non-electric vehicle is 5,000 miles. And this program has an expected conversion rate to buy an EV of 1%. And this is based on some set of historical data from a survey or some other sort of results that can back up this assertion. And for the project lifetime, we'll consider it to be 8 years, which is the useful life benchmark of a light-duty vehicle. Now, taking this set of numbers, we can see that we get a light-duty VMT reduction of 50,000 miles per year. Now, taking the results from last page, we can see inputting our 50,000 miles per year, we get a reduction of 135 metric tons of CO2 per year. Now, with the project cost of $60,000, this gives a cost effectiveness of $440. And as we mentioned before, this can use either VMT reductions from light duty or heavy duty or both, depending on the project specifics and the justifications used to back up those assertions. Now let us consider the project type for RE1 for renewable energy projects. This can be used for any new renewable electric generation project. As inputs, the calculator requires the type of renewable energy and the rated power of the project. This calculation does consider average capacity factor for each of these different energy types, so unless the usage is known to be less than all of the time for pricing or other reasons, the annual hours in use should be year-round. For our example project, we consider a solar project with 6 hours of daily sunlight and a peak rated power of 2 megawatts. To use the renewable energy calculator, we use the inputs from our previous slide and fill them into the tool at the top. Then, the cost information can be included on the Results tab to allow us to calculate the cost effectiveness of the project. In this example, we find a cost effectiveness of around $1,200 per metric ton of CO2. It should be noted that the annual emissions reduction is not the same for every year, since the grid emission factor goes down every year to incorporate all of Minnesota's state decarbonization targets. Finally, the last set of projects are the low-carbon infrastructure projects under LC1 and LC2. As noted earlier, these projects take advantage of MnDOT's MICE tool to estimate the benefits of projects which use low-carbon materials or use recycled pavement. This requires the user to first input the project details on the Inputs tab and the mitigation measure on the Mitigating Strategies tab, then click Run. Then the results can be found in the Results tab for the project type selected. For our example, we will consider project type LC2 for recycled pavement. This considers the benefits of reusing pavement from existing roadways in repaving and resurfacing projects. MICE requires the user to know the length of resurfacing as well as whether the project is on rocky or mountainous terrain. For our project, we use the following inputs for a project using full depth reclamation recycling process. Here, we have 100 lane miles with 100% of the project length getting FDR. So to do this, we take our known inputs of 100 miles of reconstruction on our rural interstate, and we input that into the project details for the project input tab of MICE. And that, as you can see for this example, would be under the existing roadway rehabilitation section, because that's what this project is. Then we would input the recycling technique information on the mitigating strategies tab. So here our technique is full depth reclamation, and we're going to say that for 100% of the lane miles of the project, we're going to use this process. Finally, we can find the emission reductions for this project on the Pathways tab. And as we can see for this specific example, they actually give a breakdown of where those reductions come from. Some come from materials and some come from construction. And this leads to a total reduction of 738 metric tons of CO2. Once we have the results calculated from the MICE tool, we take that and input it into the specific tab on the CET, as we can see here on the left. Then the results are going to populate within the Results Summary tab, where we will add the total project costs in order to get the cost effectiveness of the project. Now, it should be noted, for both the recycling projects and the low carbon materials projects, that we should only use the marginal cost or the additional cost of using this specific material or recycling technique over what it would have costed doing it the traditional way. So for this example, let's say that using the full depth reclamation is going to add to an additional $10 million of project cost. Then this is going to be what we use for estimating our cost effectiveness. And in some cases, it may only be, a small amount of extra cost Now that's the only amount of cost that's going to qualify for this program. So if the additional cost is only $100,000, then $100,000 is all that the project is going to qualify for in terms of funding for that specific process. It is quite common for a project applicant to have multiple pieces to the project which yield emission benefits. Using the carbon emissions tool, these emission benefits can be bundled together to show the total cost effectiveness of the whole project, as shown here in the gray section labeled Total. For this example, we have a bicycle project which also uses recycled pavement. Together, they get a cost effectiveness of $1,100 per metric ton. We have reached the conclusion of our presentation today. If you would like more information about the CRP program or the calculator tool, as we have discussed today, take a look on the CRP website. This website has more information about the program itself, the CET tool, and the calculation methodologies used within it. It also contains a document which provides tips and tricks on how to use the CET tool. If you aren't satisfied with any of those things, feel free to reach out to Anna Pierce with the Minnesota Department of Transportation. Thank you.